welcome. We have a history of those speakers who do the Scarborough Missions lecture not showing up for a variety of reasons, health-related, some crazy health-related problems, being snowed in, and a variety of other things. I mean, being snowed in Dallas 2 years ago, of all places. So our speaker tonight comes from Dayton, and he made his way here. I guess it attests to the hardy people that they have in Dayton these days. So with that, I'll invite Father Mike to say a few words about Scarborough and welcome you this evening. Father Mike.
Thanks very much, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. I enjoy coming to St. Jerome's because they just serve such delicious meals. I recommend you all get a chance to eat in the President's Lounge. It really is something. Tonight it's a wonderful opportunity to, on behalf of Scarborough Missions, to endorse the speaker for tonight, Vincent Miller. As you know, in Scarborough Missions, because of our experience over the years, we really feel engaged in the world in many different ways, in social justice, interfaith dialogue, and pastoral ministry, in the whole cross-cultural experience of how to proclaim the gospel in new ways in the world. And so tonight we're looking forward to, and also tomorrow morning he'll be coming to with me later on tonight to speak again, to deliver a repeat of his lecture to our people at Scarborough and our friends in Toronto. And it's really, we find it so important to engage in how do we proclaim the gospel today in our multicultural world, in the complex of communications and all the different issues that are there. And, you know, little Scarborough, we try to do what we can. And so we're delighted to be able to be with you in sponsoring this lecture, which we've been able to do for a number of years. And at Scarborough Missions at the moment, we're quite engaged in interfaith dialogue. It's something which has grown up over the years as partly because we work in a cross-cultural way, but being in Toronto and in the area around Toronto, it just kind of emerged by way of our mission center, people coming to speak to us, people wanting to have an opportunity to engage in dialogue. And all of a sudden, our mission center, sponsoring lectures, connecting with various kinds of groups, people coming in for retreats now, a Zen group, mostly Catholics, but a Zen meditation group who go out and teach in prisons, have a ministry in prisons. And so we feel we're really caught into something really wonderful, of very much of the Spirit. And that's true, I think, tonight. So we're delighted to be able to welcome our speaker who will be speaking to you in a few moments. Thank you very much.
So, as many of you know, the title of this year's lecture series is entitled Good Global Citizenship. And this is one of the lectures that, when we started thinking about putting this series together, was sort of at the core. And it really gets at so much of what we're doing at St. Jerome's right now with our students and with some of our research. And as evidence of that, a bit of a plug for our students outside, we have a table of students who are on the Beyond Borders program, the International Service Learning program that we have at St. Jerome's. Please stop by and see their table. They're selling some bracelets, T-shirts, and those kinds of things, and that's helping defray the cost that they will have when they go away in May for 3 months, working in places where there's tremendous poverty and sort of under-structured government, places like Ukraine, Peru, I think, where else? Uganda and so on. So please make your way out there. They're a wonderful group of students. Make yourself welcome to meet with them. So for tonight, we have Dr. Vincent Miller. Dr. Vincent Miller holds the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture at the University of Dayton in Ohio. Prior to that, he was the Associate Professor in Theology in the Theology Department at Georgetown University. He received his doctorate in Systematic Theology from the University of Notre Dame, a wonderful Catholic institution, apparently. I think Peter Naus has told me that on a number of occasions. Dr. Miller has published numerous articles on culture and religious traditions, beliefs, and practices. His book, Consuming Religion, Religious Beliefs and Practice in a Consumer Culture, was published in 2005. And in this book, he considers how religious communities are being transformed from within by consumer attitudes and practices. And he's also looking at how these churches and these bodies can also resist some of these changes. Dr. Miller's current research explores the impact of globalization and the culture of choice upon the fragmentation of religious communities and the polarization of religious and political discourse. Tonight's lecture is a product of that research. So, for tonight, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vincent Miller.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Father Mike. I'm honored by the invitation. I should say that I almost didn't make it. I just moved to a new city, and the taxi service there is quite a bit more informal than where I came from. So when I called last night, the guy said, just text my cell phone so I'll have where you are, and I'll come get you at 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, about 5:20, he called and said he was getting a late start. Then he showed up at 5:30, and he said he needed to find a gas station. Did I know where one was open? But so I made it here. The Scarborough Missions, as a mission society, shows us from the start that the church is global in some sense. It's universal in some sense. But the globe, the universal, isn't just one thing. It changes over time. There's different ways of constructing the whole. So we can speak of the whole world, we can speak of the planet Earth, we can speak of all creation, or we can speak of the globe, and each one of those things has a different set of meanings and is structured in a different way. So what I'd like to do tonight is to consider some of the ways that contemporary globalization is impacting our lives, and consider resources from the Christian theological and monastic traditions to face those challenges. I'm going to approach globalization from a slightly different way than we normally talk about it, although it's not as unusual these days as it was in recent times. We're accustomed to thinking of globalization primarily in terms of economics, economic ethics and development. I'd like to think about other dimensions. Economics is certainly one of the important dimensions of globalization, but the globe that we live in today is being constructed through other structures and practices, such as the global media, the internet, increased ease of travel, and the emergence of global risks, such as environmental change. All of these combine to give us the experience of what John Tomlinson calls the complex connectivity that constitutes our globalized world. This mic, I'm flickering back and forth as I look down. Could we just switch to the podium mic and I'll stay seated? About that. Globalization is transforming human existence in many ways. Today I want to focus on just one of them, and as I take this path through these changes, I'm aware that there's many other things on all sides of this that I can't talk about tonight. I want to focus on changes to the nature of social space. Globalization is freeing individuals from previous constraints of social space all over the world, both in the so-called first world and in the two-thirds world as well. Whatever the disparate economic impacts of globalization, its social consequences are a much more equal opportunity set of revolutions. Now I hesitate here because I'm from the U.S., and the U.S. and Canada are sister societies, but we're not the same society. So I don't presume that my descriptions will necessarily perfectly reflect your reality. So I'm speaking from my experience down there, and I think it will have much overlap, but I don't presume that it'll necessarily tell you everything that's going on for you. And I would hope in the conversation part of tonight I can hear some of how this fits and what else it needs to be considered. To talk about these changes in social space, I'm going to begin with two stories. They're actually images. First image. I'd like you to imagine a scene of teenagers on motor scooters. It's a social scene. Few ride alone. Both friends and sweethearts ride together, the perky pop of their small engines sounding as they ride along roads, zipping in and out of traffic with the combination of joy and risk that teenagers revel in the world over. Indian and Chinese factories have long replaced the Italian and Japanese brands we know. These inexpensive vehicles have become omnipresent in third world Asian cities and towns. Where once bicycles crowded together, swarms of scooters now fill the streets, becoming the new sound of evening. But while they crowd city streets at night, many return home to the surrounding countryside. They enable a new scale of urban youth community. Teens are freed from the provincial village neighborhoods to swim in a metropolitan mix of cruising scooters, street food, and music. A drive through the countryside reveals the rural gas stations that supply the fuel. Here, gasoline is stacked in reused 1-liter bottles sold at roadside stands alongside green coconuts, jackfruit, and durian. I witnessed this in a trip to Jakarta, Indonesia, a few years ago. My hosts explained to me that this was a recent development. One detail of the story struck me as a profound insight into the transformations that are happening in social space. Even though these scooters are very cheap, they're made in and for third world markets, they're still very expensive by local standards. How do so many poor rural families provide these middle-class luxuries to their children? One way that's become increasingly common, my host told me, is for families to sell portions of their ancestral farm plots, their rice paddies, to pay for the children's scooters. These are quite small pieces of land, right? They're selling a portion of that to buy a scooter for their children. Second example. It's not a memory of my own, it's an actual image. It's a pastoral landscape. In the distance, at the top of the hill, stand a green line of trees. In the middle ground, lighter green fields of pasture and crops slope downwards. All this is framed by branches, drooping lazily in the foreground. In the bottom corner, the rope knots of a hammock break into the image. It's an idyllic image. It's an ink-line drawing rendered in subdued tones of blue, gray, and light green. It's an image of a real place, a pre-Civil War farm outside of Culpeper, Virginia. The choice of color palette requires some comment. While it may be an intentional choice of the artist, it certainly has something to do with the medium. The image I've described is a tattoo on the back of a friend who had it inked in Kern Khan, Thailand. I don't know how to pronounce that, I confess. When she was working as a facilitator in an international study program. The image is of a farm that has been in her family for generations, dating back 2 centuries to the plantation owner who had it built. During college, she used it as a place for gatherings and retreats for an activist community at Georgetown University. Indeed, a very successful university living wage campaign was plotted there. She hopes one day to build a community education and retreat center there on the 500 acres of this ancestral plot. It's rare in U.S. society, and I suspect Canadian, to have such a place in one's life. But this touch point of her past and focus of her future hope was tattooed onto her back 9,000 miles from where it happens to be on the map. I encountered these 2 images within 2 weeks of each other. They stood out as metaphors for the ways that globalization is changing social space. In the first image, you have the literal trading of territory for mobility, of literal ground for motion. While this looks like, and it may very well be, a great impoverishment, it also confirms Zygmunt Bauman's argument that the losers in globalization are precisely those who are stuck in space. The children zipping about at night eating sweet foods in the street and listening to sweeter pop music will grow up to be factory workers, not peasants. The second image is from my own society, where we have long been relieved of our ties to particular plots of soil. Indeed, I imagine very few Americans have family histories that predate the Civil War, and a minuscule number have connections to their ancestral lands. The example is telling because even given this rare solidity, she is left to stabilize the territory in such a radically individual manner. The meaning and function of spaces increasingly becomes a matter of the intentional practices of small groups or individuals. People leave places to swim in the tide of mobility, and this tide of global mobility renders even the most stable of places dependent upon individual interpretations. I want to suggest that it's helpful to think of these effects of globalization as changes in the underlying laws of social physics, If I can use a metaphor from undergraduate physics class, we're experiencing a change in the coefficient of social friction. Coefficient of friction, to refresh some of you, is a measure of how much a given substance resists another sliding over it. Asphalt roads have a fairly high coefficient of friction. Icy roads have a fairly low one. You can steer quite aggressively when there's a high coefficient of friction. And when there's a low one, you spin out of control quite easily. So, I'm going to argue we're undergoing a profound transformation of social space along those lines, the changing in the coefficient of social friction. How does it affect our spiritual lives? I'm going to focus on three particular ways. First, the impact of choice upon community and our tendency to associate with people like ourselves. Second, the separation of communities and cultures from space. Third, the impact of this separating from space has upon our personhood, our sense of responsibility and moral agency. So, on to these three dimensions. The first one, the polarization of community, the choices we have and the choices we make. As I said, the internet gives us a stunning tool of global connection. As I was walking through the library the other day, I saw a student having a video conversation in what I think was Urdu with her parents on her laptop. 15 years ago, when I was a student at Notre Dame, the university was proud of the multi-million-dollar satellite video conferencing system they had installed, which would allow us to, when it worked, do pretty much the same thing. I mean, it usually didn't work. It was a very big deal then. It'll be on our cell phones in 5 years. This capability will no doubt change things profoundly, but what will we do with it? We could use it to forge bonds of understanding across the cultural tensions that divide our world. I can speak with some authority here, possessing both an email address and family members and friends who are fond of forwarding messages. The internet and the email circles that it enables aren't particularly open. The medium that could theoretically link people in North America with people in Karachi seems rather, to judge from my mailbox, to traffic primarily in stereotypes about the latter. Those examples don't quite disturb us, since we all probably know and are sick of the email forwarders in our own lives. But look at how the technology deepens our choice of association in an equally profound, if less annoying way. In more constrained media worlds, as we had 25 years ago in the U.S., where we had the big three networks and PBS, those were your options. And I confess I know nothing about pre-cable Canadian television, so you have to make your own connections there. People would have to settle for a perspective or mixture they didn't completely agree with, right? The lowest common denominator, which was often disparaged, united quite a lot of people. The great American social theorist Garrison Keillor once observed that it was precisely these constraints that allowed something like the miniseries of Alex Haley's Roots to foster a society-wide conversation about the legacies of slavery, because it was a social event. There were three networks. This went on for 2 weeks. It was happening around you. You would engage it or not. Now with 500 plus channels, right? I'm in a babysitting co-op and trying to stay up late one night waiting for the parents to come home, and I found the knife channel. 24-hour knife sales. In today's media world, blogs number in the hundreds of millions, beyond the Knife Channel, which really isn't quite the best example, but blogs number in the hundreds of millions. It's easy to click around until we find the one that suits us just right. Likewise, the friend networks on Facebook and other social networking sites can bring us together, but they do so in networks of individual preference and comfort. This system of choice replaces the mixtures forced upon us by public space with a world constructed around our personal preferences and comfort levels. Rather than opening us outward, our global reach locks us into our most banal preferences. This same heterogenizing force of choice recasts our religious communities. Consider the Catholic parish. Now, I don't want to romanticize here. Their history in the U.S. is decidedly mixed. They were often places that conformed to divisions among immigrant groups, and between blacks and whites after that. The immigrant groups got together once the blacks came from the South. But they were also places that brought together a whole neighborhood and provided a commonality that transcended particular parishioners' differences. And even in the far too common cases of racial tension and white flight that marked urban parishes in the U.S., flight took quite a bit longer in Catholic parishes than at Protestant congregations. The Catholic idea of the parish that made this possible is rapidly being transformed into the much more Protestant notion of a congregation, defined not by its location, but by members who elect to join. Now, this brings a lot of good. People have a clearer idea of what they belong to and what they're responsible for. And this is one of the great positives in consumerist forms of religion, which are very hard to distinguish in a formal way from intentional communities, right? The megachurch that tells you what they're about and what they're going to do for you and what they expect from you is the same thing as an intentional community, right? This is what we're here for. Now, they may do different things, but that intentionality looks a lot like consumer choice. And this heterogenization is a way of making parishes much more intentional. People don't just come there and sit there every Sunday because they live in that neighborhood. They're there to do something. They have a corporate identity, a sense of church, and that's very valuable. But it also makes the church more polarized, as believers sort themselves into communities with people whose beliefs most closely match their own. In the previous city I dwelt in, my spouse was talking to someone, and she was telling her all about their Catholic parish. And this turned out to be a very, very, very conservative parish. And my wife said, well, we're not conservative. And she said, oh, you probably want to go to this church. And she was absolutely right. We loved it. Right? But we don't have anything to do with between those two parishes. There's two separate worlds, each doing their own thing. As a result, we lose the skills necessary for getting along with those we disagree with. And we imagine community as a place where everyone agrees. Religious communities cease to be places where we learn the virtues of getting along with difference. And they become places where we're formed in that sense of community of everyone has to agree on everything. Above one entrance of the basilica on the campus of the University of Notre Dame is the famous inscription, God, Country, Notre Dame. Theologians of many stripes find this close juxtaposition of God and nationalism to be potentially idolatrous. 2 days ago, I saw this strikingly parallel triple inscription over a doorway in an acquaintance's house. Faith, family, friends. If the Notre Dame inscription warns of the potential compromises of the gospel that national assimilation required in the 20th century, these pre-cut vinyl letters in black script adorning the private space of a living room wall witness to a very different threat today, where the default imagination of community is reduced to personal relationships. I taught for many years a course at Georgetown University on globalization and religion. And at Georgetown, there are many students from the global class. And one of the most striking things about their sense of global citizenship was it was cosmopolitanism of a sort, but they understood their global citizenship to be the network of personal relationships they had around the world. And this happened throughout classes. And even as I asked them to refine that and clarify that and say that, I'm expecting you to say that, so is that really what you mean? This is far too convenient a piece of data for me. But no, they said that's exactly it, right? They have friends on all continents. They know someone to call when they go into a global city. That's their sense of global connectedness. The second challenge is related to this first one. It's often called deterritorialization. Society and culture float free from physical space. As technology frees our associations from the constraints of space to choose more broadly, it also detaches the resulting relationships and communities from space as well. Our cell phone use illuminates profound changes in how we imagine and practice space. Note how people begin their calls. Hi, I'm just getting off the plane. I'm in the luggage pickup. Hi, I'm waiting in the checkout line. Thanks to caller ID, we no longer need to identify ourselves. But we need to place ourselves when we use the phone. Landlines located us in particular places, but wireless networks follow us anywhere. We know whom we are talking to, but no longer where they are. There is in this practice of placing a profound change in our relationship to space. We may tell the person we are talking to where we are, but in some ways the very act of calling takes us out of that space. We invoke physical space even as we leave it. Social space becomes detached from physical location. We aren't being with the people at the checkout line. or being with someone miles away on the phone. The network becomes a new space, one that provides an option to be anywhere we choose. We might say that the individual in the network is now the default unit of social space. Things have changed enormously fast here. Influential accounts of the cultural effects of globalization, written just a decade ago, don't seem to notice this change being wrought by the cell phone. They still spoke of how the global comes into our domestic space in the form of phone calls and mass media. In that short period of time, we have shifted to the new social space of networks. Communication comes to our cell phones and our BlackBerries, I need to say, since I'm here, to our email or IM accounts. What used to be called private or domestic space is now very possibly wherever we are logged into the network, wherever we can get some bars. Having just adjusted to not assuming people talking to themselves while they walk down the sidewalk are mentally ill, we now have to adjust to the new construction of domestic space, people having intimate and emotional conversations on cell phones in public. A student recounted the story of coming upon a young man loudly sobbing outside of her dormitory. She approached to see what was wrong, offering to help. He put down his cell phone and yelled at her, "Can't you respect my privacy?" Now, there's a lot that's good about this, not that particular story. During the Great Depression, a great uncle of mine headed from Pittsburgh to Chicago to find work and was never heard from again by his wife and his son. My brother moved to a distant city for work, and space didn't matter. I just called his cell phone. Didn't matter where he was. Now he still screened my calls, but that's a different issue. But there are downsides to this change in our relationship with space. Consider how the cell phone insulates us from the frictions of happenstance, those unforeseen and unplanned events that bring us fortune and woe, joys and challenges. Stuck waiting for a bus, there's no need to make small talk with strangers. Call your friends. You can reach them even if they're stuck waiting for a bus somewhere else. But with this convenience comes the loss of the chance meeting that results in the unexpected friend or the lifetime love affair. We also lose the sacrificial conversation with the lonely and the uncomfortable requests from the needy. Roadside Good Samaritanism has almost disappeared in the past decade, as presumably everyone has their own cell phone and can dial for help. And I was a late adopter, and so we'd often pull over, try to help people, and they're like, I got a cell phone, don't worry. Our sharing space with them on the highway doesn't oblige us, because they are unstranded in the space of their own network connection. We aren't together in a way that creates obligation. This, I think, is the profound issue behind what is too easily identified as stodgy concerns for polite manners. The pastor in my church recently began to ask people to refrain from texting during the liturgy. I make similar requests of my students. This isn't simply a matter of manners or dividing one's attention. It's an example of the fact that we are more or less free to choose our psychic location, to stay with the lecture, the discussion, or the liturgy, or to chat with a friend somewhere else. Space has been rendered a matter of choice. There's a positive aspect of this. This renders things intentional that were once simply accomplished by a lack of options, right? So when I was sitting in calculus class, the only way out of calculus class was through a fantasy life, which I developed quite richly. I couldn't check the internet. But it can help us appreciate anew what we're doing when we're together, what the classroom is, right? It's not simply the structure that we expect you to sit through for 12, 16, 23 years, in my case. What are we doing here together? Because now you all have a choice to stay here or not. Is there something valuable in this practice that we're trying to accomplish together that needs all of us to be here? What are we doing in the liturgy? Again, it's not simply a place that kids are stuck, right? What are we doing here in this space? What is this space about? Because now space becomes intentional. That's a positive thing, but it's a positive thing that makes life much more difficult than it ever was before. Everything has to become intentional. This relationship to space closely corresponds with the experience of space constructed by global capitalism. We're enmeshed in global networks of exchange that source every dimension of our lives, from the latest gadget to our food. To take but one example, the can of frozen orange juice in my freezer informs me that it may contain concentrate from 3 continents, the US, Brazil, or China, right? Or all 3 together. Yet none of this is visible to us. We see only the products on the shelf. We don't see where they come from, how they are made, or the resources they require. Thus, our economic system does not provide any ready means for us to think about our relationship to natural resources and labor, to the places that support us, right? We literally have no idea what goes into sustaining our lifestyle. And so we have no idea of our relationship to physical space because of that. Other socioeconomic systems provide this information quite directly. Zygmunt Bauman contrasts our economy with that of a previous era, the absentee landlord. These were still yoked to the land and to the peasantry from which they skimmed their livelihood. Their land could only sustain a certain level of production beyond which yields would decline. Even the most ruthless landlord was limited by workers' physical needs. Pushing beyond these would either destroy the workforce or elicit rebellion. Either one would force them to encounter their place in the world, limitation, otherness. Our situation is quite different. Like absentee landlords, we draw our sustenance, accoutrements, and excess from distant sites. Unlike them, since we are not tied to any one place in particular, we receive no feedback on the sustainability of our demands. We are forced into no undesired encounters. Thus, commodity distancing, to use Thomas Princeton's term, trains us to imagine the space of the world as an infinite, inexhaustible frontier. My point here is not an immediately moral one. I'm not arguing that cell phones make us bad people, who don't care about what is going on around us, who blithely leave widows and orphans stranded by the sides of the roads to change their own tires. I'm not arguing that our rapacious consumption is intentionally destroying the world. I'm arguing that these two things combined lead us to not be able to imagine what it is to be in space, to experience physical constraint, to know exactly what it is we're doing. What happens when social space becomes abstracted from physical space? When it becomes a matter of choice? The communities we build in this new space float free of geographic space. We lose a sense of responsibility to our unchosen co-inhabitants. We don't face the Samaritan's dilemma because there are no roadsides in this networked world constituted in choice. What would it mean to have shut-ins in a community that's an online community, right? Who do you take the mums to at Mother's Day, right? You may still have a personal ethics, a communal ethics that is very community organized, community centered, right? That's concerned about the others around you. But there's no place around which those are located. There's no way of delineating those obligations. The final problem, the third problem, it can be described in terms of the question, what sorts of people do we become in network space? Consider Google Earth. It's an amazing interface. It's pretty much the fulfillment of what I've always imagined a computer should do ever since I was a kid. My grandfather was building computers as PCs came into existence. He never bought the Apple I, though. That would have been very nice. So since the late 70s, I've been just thrilled about computer technology, right? But up until the latter half of the 90s, there was no particular use for them, right? It was kind of an awkward typewriter. But then the internet came along, and now Google Earth. This is what I always imagined a computer would do, right? You can fly around the Earth at will, zooming in on things of interest. It's all laid out placidly before your gaze. But it's not necessarily placid. The U.S. Holocaust Museum has built an overlay for Google Earth that focuses on the crisis in Darfur. It combines high-resolution satellite images of destroyed villages and burnt huts with interviews and ground-level photographs of victims. It's an astoundingly good use of the technology, deeply immersive. But after spending some time viewing the satellite images, the photographs, and the testimonies, a disquiet sets in. A disquiet that's separate from the horrors of the genocide itself. Indeed, it's precisely our separation that's so unsettling. What does this interface really do? It lets me float above all this suffering. It lets me glide down for a closer look, but it does not let me land. Seeing the burnt-out village on the horizon, I fly that way, but arrive too late and unable to render assistance. And it's only a matter of time before such things are in real time. I can read the testimony, force myself to look at brutalized victims, watch the flies on their wounds. From the state of some of the skeletons, I can imagine the atrocities they suffered as they died. But I cannot stretch out my arm to help, speak comfort, or bury the dead. And most of the point, I feel no fear. I fly in angelic silence through a smoke-filled war zone. Spirit without flesh, impervious to harm, unable to aid. I am there and not there at all. If it weren't for the horrors of Darfur, I know I would have never noticed this. The interface is so utterly natural. A video game, yes, but also the television remote control. And above all, the mouse on the web itself, or whatever immersive gestural interface Apple or Microsoft or Nintendo is cooking up for us tomorrow. One click, one gesture, and you're there, wherever there is. The film Babel evokes this well. After a bullet pierced the window of her air-conditioned tour bus, Susan Jones, Kate Blanchett, is trapped in a rural Moroccan town, in danger of bleeding to death. Her anguished body is very much present in the town, with no resources to help her beyond an opium pipe. The tour bus abandons them. Her husband Richard, Brad Pitt, struggles to get help, finding that his cosmopolitan at-homeness in the world doesn't go very far without a tour guide and a catered itinerary. After much delay and anxiety and the use of a cell phone, a U.S. helicopter descends from the sky. Medics with American flag patches bear her away. The long air scene that follows is a relieving contrast to the claustrophobia of the town. The camera lovingly pans around the helicopter as it swifts them across the landscape, once again at the altitude from which we imagine the globe. Freed from entanglements, from the frictions and finitude of space, back into that Google Earth interface, angelic again. Interestingly, while the camera pans around the helicopter, it seems to change direction repeatedly, as if going nowhere. I was deeply moved by the relief I felt by that scene, to be back up in air and light and sky again after the pressing presence of being trapped in that town. There's a metaphor for the deterritorialized self there. Choice constructs both where we are and how we're there. Gliding through life unscathed and unconnected, the narratives of flesh and connection, of rootedness and irrevocability that constitute human life are reduced to a series of revisable clicks. So those are the three concerns I have about these changes to social space. So we have a new kind of social space with a new set of social constants. We are free to associate based on our preferences. As a result, we tend to segregate into communities of the like-minded and lose the skills necessary to get along with folks with whom we disagree. The connections and communities that we build in this space bear little reference to geographical space and thus leave no room to welcome strangers or provide much sense of responsibility for neighbors. Finally, we flee of space, as much of our communities do. We become spectators who touch down here and there in life, but have great difficulty staying or making much of an impact where we are. This is a new situation with new challenges. It's important to note that it's much easier to do as I just did, to describe these changes than to catalog the complex ways in which people engage them. Such changes don't fall into society and wreak havoc until someone figures out what to do. From the start, they're engaged and put to myriad uses, and thus their impact is moderated and turned to good. So with the awareness that people are already dealing with these problems and exploiting their potentials, I'm going to turn to sketching a few spiritual resources from the Catholic and monastic traditions for responding to them, ways of thinking about this space. And I really use these resources in the broader project as a way of diagnosing what's going on and responding to it, but I'm going to focus on the response briefly tonight. So, responding to the first dimension, here I'll speak of Catholicity as the communion of difference. For the first problem, our segregation into communities of the like-minded, the notion of Catholicity is a helpful place to respond. Now, the word Catholicity often is used to indicate the degree of being Catholic, right? Your degree of Catholicity. That's not the sense I'm intending it here tonight. It's one of the classical marks of the Church in the Nicene Creed, which affirms belief in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. It's derived from the Greek word meaning whole, complete, or universal. It is an older construction of the whole of the globe. It has many dimensions. The first one I want to talk about in this context is how it completes another mark of the Church, unity. Catholicity makes clear that unity is never mere uniformity, but a harmony of difference. The 19th century German theologian Johann Adam Möller used the analogy of the choir to describe Catholicity. The fullness of unity is found neither in wearying monotone, he said, nor in the cacophony of antagonistic discord, but in the harmony that arises from contrasting contributions of different voices to the same work. As Cardinal Avery Dulles commented on this text, Catholicity, far from excluding differences, demands them. Now, I've just offered a theological answer to a structural change in society, which is a category error. Those are great ideas. How to put them on the ground. I suspect that the Catholic unity of the Church used to be supported more by spatial inertia than by any intentional practice. As we'll see with the other problems I've mentioned, we face a situation where we need to intentionally cultivate what once happened by default. To live Catholicity today requires habits such as seeking to build and sustain relationships across the fissures of contemporary culture and the contemporary church. And I'll speak personally here, it's often much harder to embrace our sibling others than to accept radical difference. I'm guiltily struck by the fact that I'm much more comfortable with practitioners of other religions, and even atheists, than with Catholics on the other side of the culture wars. Such relationships require listening skills, knowledge of the other's concerns and perspectives, and a willingness to see them in their best light. But prior to all of those, it requires a certain practice of counter-choosing. Choosing against our desire to avoid conflict and against the desire for the easier fellowship of those who share our convictions or who at least won't challenge them. We know well how to act on our convictions when it means joining with others who share them, working towards a common purpose. Our cultural ecology threatens to turn that very laudable inclination, that good thing, into a principle of division. We must now intentionally decide to cultivate communion with those we disagree with in a world where fractiousness has become the cultural default. This use of Catholicity is a development of its classical sense. The geographical component of Catholicity has long emphasized the need to remain in communion with the universal church, whether understood in terms of the broader communion among particular churches or through the centralized bureaucracy of the Vatican and the diocese. In this, Catholicity looks very much like cosmopolitanism, which historically has been both a normative argument about human commonality and a formation for participation in imperial bureaucracies. Both classical Catholicity and cosmopolitanism, my mouth is very dry. Both classical Catholicity and cosmopolitanism, were marked by the assumption of inertia, or perhaps even better, the gravitational pull of the local. Thus, the primary struggle was to maintain ties of broader communion and to expand moral sympathies beyond the local. The local was given. It was parochial. Everyone does that, right? You have to train your imagination, your moral sympathies to go more broadly. Today, we face a radically different situation. If the global whole is hollow and socially fissile, locality has now lost its gravitational pull and even its inertia. Catholicity faces the double challenge of holding the whole together as the parts themselves are disintegrating. Okay, the second problem. The placelessness of the relationships and the communities that we build. This is a place where another dimension of Catholicity, as embrace and cultivation of the local, which flows from the first one, will provide guidance for responding. The great Canadian theologian, Jean-Marie Roger Thiard, spoke of Catholicity as the church sinking its roots into local place and culture. The original Christian meaning of Catholicity referred to the fullness of salvation. So universal, but it came from the whole. The fullness of salvation. God's salvation embraces everything, human suffering and misery, as well as human goodness and achievement. Thiard argued that both suffering and goodness were always particular. The church, in his words, the church as such receives into its own flesh the realities of creation or the fruits of human skill, together with the pains and efforts of people striving to transform the human condition. We need to attend to the places we stand, to the issues and injustices that surround us. This is another practice of counter-choosing, to let those demands choose us, even if we would prefer to work on other issues or concern ourselves with other people. When I was growing up in the 80s, I was in a Rust Belt city, Pittsburgh, and the primary focus of justice at that time was the Central American Solidarity Movement, right? Which was enormously important, but I experienced that vast disconnect. I had no idea what to do about that in Pittsburgh, where 300,000 steelworkers had been laid off. Those were two separate worlds. And I always experienced that abstraction. I met people from the Southwest who were actively working in giving respite to exiles from Central America. And for them, it was a matter of location. Their faith was in that place. They were on the borderlands. They knew the people, right? But for me, it always remained abstract because it simply wasn't where I lived. Not that I shouldn't be concerned about it, but I didn't have any way to really be engaged in justice in the place that I was, or at least I never fell into those circles. So that's a practice of counter-choosing, to let those demands choose us. At a time when local memories are fading, the real histories of salvation and its opposite that have taken place in communities are in danger of being lost. The church has an essential task in being the church of those particular places, to remember their histories, witness to their sufferings and salvation. As we increasingly learn, these local histories are not merely human affairs. Salvation encompasses all of creation, and so must the Catholicity of our churches attend to the life, history, and crises of their local bioregions. If our placelessness is grounded in our literally mindless consumption of consumer goods, which again I'm saying is structural, not our own moral weakness, then embracing our locatedness can be helped by more mindful attention to the sources and consequences of what we consume. If the commodity veil hides the origins and true costs of our goods from us, we can intentionally seek out this information to better understand the sustainability or unsustainability of our lifestyles. The local food and local economy movements likewise provide practices for better understanding our connections to place. I think the practice of footprinting here is a very helpful one because this provides you an artificial way of calculating your impact on the earth, because we certainly don't see what our impact is. So we have to go and artificially simulate our impact on the earth so we can have a sense of what we're actually doing. That's the sort of mindfulness that we need to know what our relationship to the world actually is. The world is a physical place. Finally, a response to the third problem, the rootless selves that this context creates. We can find resources in the monastic notions of stability and enclosure here, I think. Many monastic orders take a fourth vow of stability in addition to poverty, chastity, and obedience. This probably originally focused on commitment to living the rule, but it later came to indicate a commitment to one monastery. This contrasts with later religious orders that stressed itinerancy and mission. Franciscans are expected to move every 5 years or so. Monks, in contrast, remain in place. Now, it's easy to read this in terms of discipline and perseverance, and that's certainly part of it. But there's something more here. In Athanasius' Life of Anthony, the founding father of Christian monasticism sets off seeking a place of isolation for prayer. Upon finding the place he will live out the rest of his days, Athanasius tells us that Anthony, quote, falls in love with the place, as though inspired by God. Interestingly, the text immediately goes on to discuss that he plants a garden to provide food for himself and hospitality. Place and body are bound together. An Irish monastic tradition sees the monk's cell as the place of resurrection on the last day. One of the short stories of Wendell Berry has the eschaton being present right in the place where people have always lived, and the character at the end of the story is walking through this land where everyone who's ever lived there is living together still. I don't want to romanticize this. It's easy to do in our hypermobile society. Few of us will settle forever in one place. Abbot Anthony Bloom downplayed the importance of what he called a line drawn in the sand for stability. At the heart of stability, there is the certitude that God is everywhere, he said. That if I can't find God here, I shan't find him anywhere. I've been wondering for some time whether we need to think about how to apply the Paschal mystery to place. It seems to me that much of the underlying spirituality of 20th century Catholic theology was the application of the Paschal mystery to human historicity. God is at work in human history, bringing the kingdom to birth. Indeed, it was common to speak of the Incarnation as God's entrance into history. Influenced by existentialism and the rise of historical consciousness before it, and living in a century of enormous historical events and movements, many Christians imagine their vocation as following God in the mix and mess of history, embracing the joys and crosses of their age, struggling to discern their own personal callings in the midst of these great events. But the Incarnation is not just God's entrance into history. It is God becoming flesh, accepting the finitude of space as well as time. A spirituality focused on history leads us to look for the next big event. And as generations have noticed, including those kids on scooters in Jakarta, these tend to happen in the bright lights of the big cities, in government buildings, boardrooms, and art galleries. Not in Nazareth. Sister Margaret McKenna, who's in Erie, Pennsylvania, reworks the ancient monastic practice of retreat to the wilderness for the contemporary moment. She notes that the wilderness was not primarily understood as escaping to nature, but from the entanglements of empire. She suggests that such abandoned places can be found in today's empire as well, in the inner cities and Rust Belt towns, the blasted landscapes that are the underside of the current global order. The parts of the world outside the shining global cities and bright media, the rest of the story. Applying the Paschal mystery to space has us look not only at big events in important places, but in every corner of the world, including the one under our own feet. From this perspective, we are already in the drama of salvation. We don't watch it from a distance. We don't float above it like angels. We're implicated in it already, possessing not only eyes, but feet, hands, and voices to act and speak. And where our feet are on the ground, we have a different kind of knowledge, gained not from distance, not from sight, but in relationship, in action, in conversation, practical and engaged and connected from the start. Compare that sort of knowledge with the kind of abstract knowledge we gain in our digital interfaces with the Darfur experience, where our legitimate convictions and concerns that we develop in those experiences face the enormous hurdle of moving from our solitary, silent, and passive stance into action. Local knowledge is already in relationship and action. Now, I'm not urging a return to what Ulrich Beck calls the monogamy of place that was an early form of modernity, the national scale, where our knowledge and allegiances are focused on our own nation. We will no doubt continue to be mobile people. Rather, I'm arguing that the monastic notion of stability can help correct our angelic rootlessness. The urge to fly away comes much more frequently than occasions of suffering or war. Margaret Funk speaks of her cell as a place where she wrestles with boredom that urges us to flee from the present. We live in an age of endless exits from our discomfort with the present. We carry the internet in our pockets, and in a second can flip that phone or BlackBerry open to check our mail, text messages, or the latest news feeds. We need to practice being present to where we are and being open to God's presence, here and now, being present to the unchosen gift of the ground beneath our feet and to the people around us. Now, as I said, our response to these changes is already long underway. What I want my account to do is to focus on some of the particular unseen challenges of the moment. So I see one of my great, what I think of as the task that I can serve to the church is to point out these likely roadblocks in the current moment. I don't mean that to be a pure exhortation of 45 minutes of pessimism. Our response to these changes is already underway. I hope that this account can contribute to your own attempts to live into these challenges in a Christian and humane manner. I also hope that the tools from the theological monastic traditions I have suggested give you a sense that we can respond to these challenges. And I offer those just as examples, not as the necessary ways to go, but as examples that the tradition has something to say to this new moment. And I encourage you both to consider those specific examples, but more importantly, to work to develop the ones most relevant in your lives and in your traditions, individually and communally. We face a situation where many aspects of society and community that were once accomplished by default have been rendered reflexive and intentional. It's up to us to learn how to drive in this time of choice and social fractiousness without running our collective car off the road. Thank you.
Thanks, Vince. We have about 20 minutes for questions. We have microphones at either side of the room, so if you have a question, please make your way to the microphone. Please frame your question as a question. Please keep it short, and speak clearly into the microphone. You're being recorded. So I'm going to first question here, and then I'm actually going to ask a question. It's my prerogative.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much. Had some very important insights about social networks and so on. I do welcome your suggestion that we consider this a conversation rather than as traditional just asking questions. Try to be very brief, nevertheless. I'd like to see you frame this within what I might call co-creation. I think this is very, very important. It gets at the essence of our being. So I would talk about maybe open, collaborative co-creation and think in terms of social networks, integrated knowledge, in effect creating knowledge networks so we can better see the effects of what we're doing. I think we really need to see what we're doing as a species and what others are doing on our behalf when they produce products and services, as you were getting at. But I think it would be very advantageous, I'm supposed to be brief, to in the future maybe try to frame what you're saying within the context of co-creation. You talked about relationship and action, that's sort of getting in that direction, but I think co-creation is getting more biblical, and it starts to bring in more the thinking of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. The mega point is sort of when humans become increasingly like God. God is most known for his creative efforts, shall we say. So it's now I know in some Catholic circles he isn't too popular as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, not God. But anyway, that's all I have to say.
That's very helpful. I really wrestle with this because, hopefully by giving you some of my biographical asides, I'm not a Luddite, right? I've been playing with computers since I was a little kid, and I like them very much. And I very much see that there's an enormous potential here, right? So there's the humankind can be brought together on the internet in a way that it's hard to imagine anything else that could be as powerful to do that. And I'm very interested in the potential of the internet for new kinds of social organization, new kinds of political organization and action. But I have to say, I haven't. I'm not a researcher in this field. I dabble in that literature, and I've talked to some very globally engaged and politically engaged students over a decade about it. And I hate to say this, but I'm really struck by how the ones who accomplish the most politically do so in old-fashioned, community cells, and do local politics. I think, and I take no credit for this whatsoever, but one of the students who founded STAND, the Student Darfur Coalition, was a student at Georgetown many years ago. And I had the students over the years do a certain encounter with that Darfur experience. And their relationship to those kinds of digitally mediated political movements, like STAND, was terribly minimal, and they consistently talked about that. They said, I want to join this group. Sure, I'll send my email in. I'll give them my address. I'll call the Secretary of State when we're told to do so. I'll contribute to the cause. But they didn't really feel that was real. So I want to be open to the revolutionary potentials of this. One thing that emerged in a recent conversation with some colleagues about digital pedagogies and the new learning styles that digital technologies are bringing is to move beyond, I sounded rather pessimistic tonight, move beyond good or bad, right? To be the new Plato saying, well, this digital stuff is just the end of civilization. It's the worst thing since writing. To move beyond whether it's good or bad, to get to the particularities of the kinds of knowledge that it creates, and the particular habits of engaging knowledge. And I confess that on that front, I don't see the internet living up to the kind of evolutionary bringing together of the human species that we, from the outside, we think it could be.
For the most part, but you saw with respect to the election of Obama that it brought funds where funds wouldn't otherwise be. It brought people together in work teams and so on. I think what actually happens there needs to be fully explored, but it did appear to have made a significant contribution to social change in that it helped him win over Hillary, first of all, and then secondly win the election. But most of the time it's really face-to-face, small groups perhaps that are most effective at this point in time.
But I appreciate your question, and it's something that I do feel like I need to say more about, so thank you.
So my question, Vince, is throughout your talk you were citing a number of metaphors, trying to think through some of what's going on today, sort of floating above the clouds, looking down. You mentioned the work of Zygmunt Bauman a number of times, and one of the metaphors that he sometimes uses to think about what we're doing in modern or even arguably postmodern societies is, are we a tourist, who has a home but will go out and sort of observe, but really not capture an authentic experience of a place, perhaps, arguably, and then return home. And that experience becomes their connection to, say, Morocco or Cambodia or wherever you visited. Another metaphor is the vagabond, the one who is without a home and is home everywhere, arguably. Do either of those metaphors work for you at all? Or if neither of those two, is there something? 'Cause, I know my students would understand both of those metaphors relatively well. And our Beyond Borders students out there sometimes will talk about poverty tourism, where you go out, you look at the people who are poor, you have your experience with those poor people, you feel like you understand them, you understand their conditions, and then you come home to relative opulence. Okay, so maybe what I'm getting at here, maybe talk around that. That's a big question.
It's an enormously seductive metaphor that I don't find helpful, because obviously we know we don't want to be tourists, right? So maybe in that sense, in foregrounding the tourist problem, I find not being a tourist to be so terribly, terribly difficult. As a Catholic theologian and academic, I'm invited to all sorts of places around the world, and I can really just go anywhere. I've been in horrible neighborhoods on all sorts of continents, right, where tourists never go, under the guise of solidarity. And it's something that I in no way disparage, but the difficulty of really doing that just astounds me. And so there's poverty tourism. I'm sure that's a problem to some extent, but I find that what can be really transformative about those sorts of immersion experiences with the fear of poverty tourism in the background is the real experience of how different space is for us than for others, right? To really know what a vagabond's life is like. So I can say, 3 or 4 different times I've been in very dangerous places with people telling me their stories and saying, don't forget us. And I don't. But I just fly right out of there, right? There's no, it just scandalizes me that there's nowhere in the world I can't go because I have this little blue book in my pocket that says the Marines come get me, And I've got institutions that, have arrangements to get me if something happens. And I don't feel that power normally. But one example of, I think, the value of those immersive experiences, I went on a cross-border experience in the Maquiladora districts in Mexico and Texas. And so one day we were talking to, a group of 5 men who were headed back to Washington, D.C. And one of them had been kicked out of there, and he was heading back to continue his job. And there was another young man there who was apparently very wealthy, and thought he was going to be allowed in for some reason, and he wouldn't. And he was in North Mexico from Honduras with his grandmother, and they had no money left. There was someone there who had 2 children at home in Guatemala, and the pay he receives doesn't pay for milk for children, right? He's got 2 children, so he can't stay. He has to go. And they were beat up, And then we were told, how many people die crossing that river. The real experience and value of that, which is, not as easily dismissed as poverty tourism, is when I returned to the airport in McAllen, Texas. I called home, and my wife said, we have the flu. I had a late flight, late connections and all that. See if you can come home faster, right? So I just walked up to the desk and I said, my family's sick, can you get me on an earlier flight, right? They took my bag and I was out of there at 550 miles an hour, in 20 minutes, right? Just, sure, we'll put you on the next plane. And as I flew over the scrubland in southern Texas, I realized those 5 guys that I just met, right, were crossing that line too, and no one took their bag. Coming across the bridge there are two canals. One's the Rio Grande and one's something else. And it really hit me like I couldn't figure out which one is which, right? But for them, one of them is the one you die to get across. So the tourist vagabond distinction, I think, is valuable in that it gets us into that difficult space of figuring out how not to be a tourist. It's seductive when it provides this simplistic way of being in the world that we can easily divorce ourselves from. So the fact that our power and our citizenship and our privilege makes us tourists, no matter how much we want to bend that into another direction. And it gives us a power, a very limited power, so we can, with great virtue and perseverance, find some way to actually be in solidarity and remain in solidarity with those people we meet. But that's simply not easy, and it's not a matter of moral failing, right? It's a matter that the freedom we have just doesn't do that. And that experience, I think, is very valuable. And I'd like to have a better word for it. But I guess Bauman starts the conversation in a way that gets to that difficult point.
Thanks. Any other questions?
I want to thank you for your presentation tonight. My question has to do with an issue around pedagogy, and I thought you might be a person who could shed some light on this. I notice with young children involved within the computer age, they're so isolated within their own little world. A lot of times they don't even know what's going on around them. And I think of your own experience in growing up with computers. How does that kind of an experience affect your pedagogy? How do you teach your students so that they know when they're in the world of cyberspace and when they're in this world?
Seeing my children's grade school classroom, I realize that the pedagogical shift that's happened without my being aware of it. As you can see tonight, I'm a verbal person. right? I mean, from first grade, they have smart boards in the classroom. So when my daughter learned American history, right, there was slide after slide after slide after slide. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I mean, the conversation that I recently had back home about pedagogy was that one of the things we need to do is really help students think about those different kinds of knowledges and the different kinds of experiences that are there. What I've found in the academy is that we're sort of divided by people who are, well, there's sort of three groups, right? There are the sort of the clear rejectors, you know, somewhat Luddite of all this, right? That this is no good can come of it. There are the enthusiastic boosters, and then there's about 95% that are just not really sure what to do about it. So I guess that's a long answer to say I don't know how to answer your question, but I think it's a really good one. So. I can say one thing I say on that front that I think works with about 10% of the students is that when class begins now, when I ask them not to text or I ask them to turn off their cell phone, I ask them to turn off, not leave it on vibrate, because we'll hear the vibration and everyone want to know what text you're getting. And I say this, I give them the line that I gave you here, right, is that space has now become intentional. And we have to think about what it is we're doing in this classroom for 50 minutes 3 times a week. This is a particular practice here. And I'd say a minority of them get it. I mean, it seems to be sliding, but I'm getting older. Last year there were eye rolling involved in that statement. I'm not sure they ever quite got it, but I just try to foreground the fact that this is a very powerful thing here, and it's doing something else, and we can't take for granted what happens in this classroom. Why do we come together? And that's some particular kind of thing as well. So that maybe is a better answer. So
I'm going to take the prerogative again and ask you one more question, if you don't mind. This has to do with the Catholic Church in terms of developing your theology for globalization. Asking the question that is at the center of this lecture: sort of where are we? And this has to do really with liturgy. And you walk into a Catholic church, particularly the older Catholic churches, and the first thing you see when you come in the door, is the altar and the cross. Okay, I mean the sense there is very clear. It's Christ the center, it's the cross, those kinds of things. Now, maybe that's a way of creating space that belonged to a prior era. Okay, and if so, then here comes the question. Okay, then for today's young person, for example, who's growing up in a space that is much more elusive, it's more out there. Their sense of centeredness may not be what yours was, or my grandfather, or prior generations. So how do we think about the way that we do Mass? How do we think about communion? Things that within the Catholic tradition bind us together and bring us together, and that's sort of at the core of who we are, even though we're Catholic. I mean, you got a little bit of that. Could you maybe address that a little bit?
So an evening of fantastic questions that I can't answer. I come at this from two absolutely irreconcilable directions. On the one hand, I'm struck that the Vatican II liturgy, by its great simplicity, as one person once said, an almost Zen-like focus on bread and wine, and simple gestures. In that sense, it's a very modern ritual, and some of the most profound experiences of liturgy in my life have been in that mode. I think there's a lot to that, precisely as a different habit of ritual and visual engagement, right? The simplicity itself is a challenge to our overstimulated world. And the Roman rite itself has always been a very, very formal and restrained rite. The other, when I talk out the other side of my mouth, I say, the Baroque had it right. And there was this massive program of propaganda, and not not with the negative sense that we necessarily attribute to it today, right? And our children need to have all these images and gestures and all the stuff in their head, right? Because they're getting all this other stuff. I mean, they're endlessly bathed in images, so they should have the Christian and Catholic ones in there too. And there's some, and that stuff competes well, right? We were reading, my daughter won a book on the lives of the saints from her confirmation class, so I was reading through it, and it wasn't one I would have chosen, but it's graphic and gripping, and so I'm trying to edit it at dinner time as I'm reading it, right? But they're paying attention, right? Because her head's half severed, right, and she lives for 3 days, and I'm struck by that too, right? That they've got all kinds of other crap in their head. Now, this is, some of this wouldn't be my first choice, right? But this gets them connected to the narrative and to the symbols. And so I'd say both. I mean, I see my children responding to both. When we go on Christmas Eve and the sanctuary is darkened and there are just candles in there, it works for them. And then they turn the lights on and then they're just gone. And when we read, the gruesome stories of martyrdom, again, they're paying attention. So somewhere between those two. I guess what I'd say is this was my response to Avatar. Right? And it struck me that so many of the reviews were like, well, it's just it's a lousy story. The plot's thin. It's hackneyed. Every schlocky convention from that class of story, right? Is thrown in there. It's not a very good film. It's not very good cinema. No, this was the first point in which we are able to completely create an immersive alternative reality. This is an epical moment. The film, and it did a lot on that front. I think the film played with that a lot on its front. Cameron works in images. I still think that the playground nuclear scene from Terminator 2 is one of the most profound presentations of nuclear horror there is. I think it ranks as one of the great scenes in cinema, I think. He's not a maker of fine film, but that scene embodies for me my entire understanding of what nuclear weapons do. It's a horrific scene. There were scenes like that in this film, and it plays with it. The scene, and I forget the characters' names, I'm sorry, the tall blue woman and the paralyzed Marine. At the final battle with the bad Marine mercenary guy, she breaks into the place where the pod is, and she saves his human flesh, right? And their eyes meet, and her tear falls on him, right? And here there were real bodies in the midst of all this simulation. So that was a very interesting scene to stick in the middle of this perhaps escape velocity for human fantasy from reality. So that was there, but that was not and if that perhaps was, I don't think there's necessarily a climax in the way those scenes work. It was responded to by the second scene, which was, of course, we get off the hook and he goes to the Tree of Souls and he goes into the bright blue body and everything's fine. So did that undo that first scene? Did it just abandon flesh and go into fantasy? Well, it did it through the mediation of an organic world, right, through the Tree of Souls. It wasn't through the computer pod. It seems to me that authenticity, I would say, and false images, the lure of images, maybe I'm not answering your question at all, but I would say where I begin to say is that the lure of images and the lure of the possibility of just simply creating things out of whole cloth, putting John Kerry with Jane Fonda and having that do the work, is to have people be in touch with their own flesh and their own bodies and with the particularity of flesh. There is something in that scene about the healthy body protecting the broken body, but also the body that couldn't live in this atmosphere. They return us to flesh, and there's so much in the sacraments, and there's so much in Catholicism about that. I think that's the place to begin. I may not have answered your question at all, but...
Well, it was a really good answer.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Vince, very much for this evening. Just some of you may not know I don't know, maybe you do, about Avatar, the film that's been basically ruling the world. I mean, I hate plugging this film, but honestly, after the last answer, I mean, if you can see Avatar in 3D IMAX in particular, it is staggering. I mean, I did. And there's these little fireflies. If you see it in 3D, I actually found myself, yes, grabbing after them. It's amazing. So where the blur between authenticity and something that is completely generated is very difficult to deal with cognitively in that experience. So see the movie for that. Think theologically. Think about the flesh, about the brokenness of flesh, and those kind of things. I think you're onto something there, Vince. I feel a paper coming on this one for you. So to wrap up this evening, I've asked Dr. David Perrin, president at St. Jerome's University, to say a few words of thanks to our speaker.
Thanks very much, Dr. Klein. And it certainly is a pleasure to welcome you to St. Jerome's University, Vincent, and a pleasure to have had the opportunity to reflect on you this evening. Where are we? Responsibility, spirituality, and place in a golden age. I would also, before I get to my comments and other words of thanks, I'd like to also thank Father Mike Traer and the Scarborough Foreign Missionaries for your participation and sponsorship of this lecture tonight in partnership with St. Jerome's University and the Center for Catholic Experience. Year after year, you sponsor this lecture and you partner in this way, and we're very grateful to you and your community for this relationship. I'd also like to recognize we have with us this evening our Vice Chair of the Board of Governors, Maureen O'Donoghue-Rich, and our Chancellor, Dr. Peter Naus. Thank you for joining us this evening. So, Dr. Miller, you have indeed brought us along a pathway tonight. We started somewhere in a global village, and we ended up in an illusory avatar. And somehow you're asking us to find ourselves in between these two, and I will use that word intentionally, realities, because they're both very real. You've helped us understand that this global church that does lie in between these two realities somewhere has various expressions, and this range of expressions has a very real influence on our lives. Global village or avatar, both have a real influence on our lives. Not theory, not speculation, but on the ground kind of stuff. Not only driven by economics, but environmental and cultural drivers as well, as you so well have articulated for us tonight. The significant transformation of social space described in such meaningful metaphors as you have brought before us certainly tantalizes the imagination and grounds our senses. You talked about scooters and tattoos, and what do these have to do with anything? However, you've mentioned that scooters replace place for mobility and tattoos image for place. Again, we're found somewhere in between, trading one value off for another. Social space is changing us. This you have helped us understand in a new and fresh way. The choice of our community, why we belong to each other. We have somehow understood that our desire to belong with each other is perennial, but we don't always belong in ways that are meaningful and life-giving. We've understood that belonging at times can separate from that which is different. Also, the transformation of social space, you've informed us, is a separation of, at times at least, community from space. cell phones, and indeed Blackberries, as you kindly referred to, being here in Waterloo, disembody us from space. Media separates from the immediate and carries us elsewhere. And you helped us understand that this separation at times is very costly. We float in between, neither here nor there, but somewhere, but where are we? Neither acting, nor reacting, nor obliging. So the choice of psychic location can indeed lead us to be lonely people. And what kind of people do we become in this space, neither here nor there? You mentioned that our personhood is indeed at risk in this adventure. Deteriorized self leads to a loss of self, a loss of self-identity, to the point where we become spectators upon our own lives, oblivious of the who and the what that surrounds us. Happily, you did not leave us in this quandary without some resources to which we can salve upon the situation. Ancient resources that you pointed to, and a few key words I will mention, but a couple. You talked about Catholicity and the unity of difference, live Catholicity. We need to develop habits that bridge difference and recognize otherness. Catholicity that cultivates a relationship with that we would rather push away. Catholicity that challenges us to hold together that which drifts us apart. And you talked about monasticism, something very dear to my heart as a follower and a student of John of the Cross. Monasticism helps us out as well in this quandary, because it leads us to reflect upon commitment and perseverance, stability, and helps us understand the omnipresence of God, the flesh of God in history, in time, in place. Monastics help us understand that we are not disembodied spirits, but we are rooted in earth, and I would like to suggest we are rooted in dirt, in the messiness of life. And what I hear you really inviting us to, Dr. Miller, is that at times we need to take a mud bath. We need to cover ourselves in its healing and spiritual uplifting, the weight of the mud that makes us one with the earth and keeps us from floating too high because of its weight. And so a spiritual mud bath perhaps is the antidote to some of the quandary which you present to us tonight, a source of salvation. And I would like to thank you so very much for this reflection on space. Thank you.
Just a few final matters. We have a sign-up sheet out in the lobby. If you'd like to receive emails from the lecture series, please sign up. I understand that there's some of you who've signed up and are not getting emails. If you would, please see Andrea out there. Leave your name with her, and we will make triply sure that you're getting those. With no sense of irony whatsoever, the lecture series is on Facebook. So if you are interested in looking at us on Facebook, you will find us under the St. Jerome's Lectures in Catholic Experience. Just a couple of very quick thanks to Andrea for helping with this evening, putting everything together. The IT staff at St. Jerome's. Just on your way out, you'll notice that there is a table full of coffee and chocolates. It's put on by the University Catholic community, and you'll find fairly traded coffee there. So if you're needing some coffee and a bit of a caffeine jolt, please stop. So our next lecture is March 19th. Joe Gunn will be talking about public justice in Canada and globally. And until then, my last words are, I wish you a safe trip home, and God bless.